Grew up all over the state. Born in Portland, raised in Tillamook where my father had been born. Lived in Eastern Oregon briefly while my dad was logging up there. Educated in Eugene at the university and lived here in Salem in state government. So lived in all 5 congressional districts. The most stunning epiphany in my life was when we left Tillamook, Oregon and moved in 1938 and early 38 to southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in southern Africa. And you take a young kid out of Tillamook, Oregon. I had my 11th birthday on the Queen Mary going over to England before we went down to Cape Town. And you know, here I was raised in a conservative, democratic family, hard-shell fundamentalist Protestant family. We had certain reservations, I guess, about blacks, and those were my only playmates. The nearest white family was 3 miles away. Being Protestant, although my cousins were all Roman Catholic, we had certain problems with the Pope and so forth. And it kind of destroys any lingering inherited prejudice. And then we came home in '39, February and March of '39, just before World War II broke out, on a boat loaded with German Jewish refugees. And these kids were my playmates, and many of them could speak English. And they told me what Hitler was doing to their family. And I came home just absolutely dedicated as an internationalist, free trading, civil rights, civil liberties, supporting almost 12-year-old. I never decided to run. I was the vice president of a life insurance and fire and casualty company in Oregon. And while I was there, I decided that I had a guy who was a TV broadcaster who ought to be governor. And he'd lost a primary, he'd run a primary and lost a general for Congress in 1954, Thomas William Lawson McCall, most commonly known as Tom McCall or Lawson McCall. Then I called him in December when the Secretary of State said he was not running again, Howell Appling. But I said, you've got to run for Secretary of State in '64 to run for governor in '66. And he said, Clay, I would consider it, but Audrey is opposed and she has at least 4 good reasons. So I said, what are the reasons? He told me. I said, come tonight. I've got this new case of German Schinkenhager gin. We'll crack the first bottle. And the 4 of us sat around, my wife and his wife and I and Tom sat around the dining room table, and I took each of Audrey's 4 objections. I'll go through this quickly, and answered them. And she permitted him to consider running. And so that's what launched Tom for that office. Well, he got elected. We're down at Dorchester, and he and Audrey invite Clay and Elizabeth to lunch, and he said, you know, my office needs help. Howell Appling abolished my personal assistant Secretary of State. I want you to come down and take the job and run the office while I run for governor. And then he immediately appointed me to replace him. So I had never held public elective office. And I didn't seek the job. I wanted to really be the executive assistant to the governor, but I ended up being in the office downstairs instead. The first thing I did in my first month was appoint a group of private CPA specialists to make suggestions for reforms and how we could get into performance audits to do a better job. And then I had a whole slew of election law reforms, some of which had been Tom's ideas, some of which have been mine, one of which was John Kennedy's idea for some public funding tax credits. We were the first state in the nation to provide for tax credit if you made a modest, I think we started at $25 and I think it's now up to $50 or $100 a person. You know, you just take, I guess I'd call it borrowing, other people might call it stealing. You take ideas from anybody that has a good idea. I don't remember any of us ever learning anything by listening to ourselves. The hero there and the sponsor of that was Don Stathos, the Republican state representative from Jackson County out in Jacksonville, Medford area. Don had this real deep belief that we ought to have bikeways in Oregon. And I became a supporter because I rode a bike illegally here in the Capitol, and I'd park the bike in my office. And then if I had a quick meeting maybe with the treasurer, I'd just ride the bicycle through the Capitol building. Did manage to avoid employees and visitors, but I was to give a commencement address in Baker High School in Baker City. And Don Stathos heard about it and said, "Clay, I've never heard you give a commencement speech. Can I go with you?" And I was flying up in a private plane to give the commencement. So he parked his very fancy racing bike, locked it here in front of the Capitol. We flew to Baker early in the afternoon, and we flew back about midnight. And I drove him back to the Capitol, to his bike. But there was no bike. Somebody had cut the chain and stolen his bike. And the bike bill was to be signed the next day. So Don said, "Clay, can I borrow your bike?" And the seat of my bike is where Governor Tom McCall signed the bike bill. I was given an opportunity to invest in some California real estate in the Silicon Valley. And needless to say, that was extremely profitable. But when it was announced that we were buying this apartment, or this business building in California, the Oregon bankers and everybody else went ballistic. You know, why are you investing out of state? And I stole a phrase from Tom McCall on pollution. He had said about the Columbia River and the Willamette River. The Willamette River, polluted water flows across artificial boundaries, and then the big plant up in the state of Washington that belched smoke that came into Oregon, polluted air wafts across the Columbia River and state boundaries. And I said, money is equally fungible. You lend money to an Oregon bank and they lend it out of state and make more money. Why shouldn't we do that ourselves directly? Well, needless to say, the bale of hay fell on me. And Frank got very upset, their lobbyist, and other people did. And so I said, okay, I'll invest some money in Oregon. But what I'll do is, I'll do it with Oregon banks, but the big banks want the money. It's the little banks who need the money. So we set up two lending accounts in the Treasury. We had a competitive bid on that participated in mostly by big banks, and they would come in and bid, and then we would take the average of the successful bids that we accept and then say to any small bank in Oregon, you may borrow money at the same rate. So we invested much more in Oregon, but we started investing much more outside, and the real estate just paid off fantastically. Sidebar on investments as well as names: when Roger Meyer, M-E-I-E-R, and Clay Meyers, M-Y-E-R-S, bought 40% of Fred Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R, three different spellings, no relation. And then a state senator, Ted Kulongoski, got terribly upset with us because it was a non-union shop. Betty Roberts did not like, nor did Jason Bowe like, my shutting down the little window where legislators cash checks. The Constitution says you may not disperse any money without legislative approval. And it was illegal, unconstitutional, probably fattening and otherwise immoral for the treasurer to have been cashing checks. But treasurers had always acceded to the desires of the legislators. And Tuck Wilson, being an attorney, immediately told me I couldn't do that. So we shut down the window. Well, one of the reasons was Jason Bowe's son's checks had bounced, and Betty Roberts liked to cash her checks there, and everybody else did. She was co-chair of Ways and Means, and we did not have a single hearing until after the 4th of July, in the longest session up to that time in the state's history, 1977. She wouldn't permit a hearing on the state treasurer's budget because I wouldn't permit check cashing. My wife and I, and she had never been to Africa, and so I went to George H.W. Bush, my friend in Washington, and got introductions and letters to the ambassadors of the countries we were visiting: Kenya, Zimbabwe, the old southern Rhodesia that I'd lived in, South Africa. Needless to say, I was being sponsored by a group that was probably a front organization for the fascist government of South Africa. Desmond knew it. Nobody in the United States knew it. State Department did not know it when I visited with them. And the first day we get into Johannesburg, I'm trying to meet Desmond. So I go down in St. Mary's Cathedral, and the church bulletin board is in error. They haven't updated it. So we get to church an hour late, and people are coming out as we're going in. And this black dean who'd been preaching is shaking hands with people, and we start to leave, and he said, "Are you looking for church?" And we said, "Well, that's why we're here." And he said, "Well, stay around. I'm going to be doing a baptism, and at least I can give you a tour." So here's this black dean leading us into the chapel. He's a black doing a baptism for a colored family. Meets me, gets some background. We find out we agree. And he said, "Why don't you join us for lunch?" And I said, "What I really want to do is meet Desmond." He said, "Well, let me see if I can set it up," after he got to know me. And so the end of that week, Friday night, 5.5 days later, he arranges the dinner, but not with Desmond. We have everybody's black doctor for the whole community. Nelson Mandela's doctor, Desmond's doctor, everybody's doctor. And we get the mayor of maybe Soweto, and we have all these other people. And they get us in the back room of a restaurant and just pound away at me. And my answers all come out right. So they then agree to set up a meeting with Desmond the next week after we get back from what is now Namibia. It was then Southwest Africa. So we finish the rest of our tour and get our third trip back to Johannesburg. And they've arranged a meeting for an hour at Desmond's office. That guy's a sweetheart, and he's a saint, and that's my first of 11 meetings with him. I've met with him in Portland, Oregon at the airport. I've met with him in National Church Convention in New Orleans, which I arranged for him to get to. He had had his passport lifted, and they wouldn't give him a visa to come as a major speaker to the National Church Convention. And the other main speaker was to be George H.W. Bush. And I knew him, and I knew his secretary, so I called their office, and I said to the secretary, "You realize that the Vice President of the United States is going to be booed at the National Church Convention for Reagan's refusal to let Desmond come to the United States." Within 3 days, we had his visa.